There is nothing in the music industry quite like a vocal group that cannot agree on who gets to be the star. Not managers, not label executives, not bad contracts. Just 5 people who all believe, with complete sincerity, that the group would be fine if it were just them on the stage alone. Tonight, 12 soul and R&B groups that prove that theory wrong, spectacularly, in front of the entire world. Every story is verified. Every song is one you already know.
We belong together.
Number 12, The Supremes. Florence Ballard founded the group. She chose the name. When the original Primettes were reshaping themselves into something Motown could market, it was Florence who held the original lineup together, the one who had the nerve and the gravitational pull to make a group out of girls from the Brewster Douglas housing projects on Detroit's East Side. And then, slowly, systematically, and with the specific efficiency that Berry Gordy applied to every business decision he ever made, Florence Ballard was moved to the back. Baby Love hit number 1 on the pop chart in 1964 and launched a run of 5 consecutive chart toppers that made the Supremes the most successful female group in American history up to that point. The voice you hear leading almost all of them, the voice that defined that run, the voice that Berry Gordy had decided was the face of the group, was Diana Ross. The voice of the woman who had started the whole thing was progressively mixed lower, given fewer lead moments, and eventually reduced to background. What makes the Supremes' internal dynamic unusual is how long it persisted as a wound before it became a rupture. Florence kept performing. She kept showing up, in the sequined gowns, hitting her marks, singing her harmonies, while the promotional machine built around Diana Ross grew more explicit with every release. Gordy was by this point in a personal relationship with Ross that complicated every professional decision he made about the group. By 1967, Florence Ballard had begun showing up to performances visibly affected by alcohol, something her biographers and former colleagues have consistently traced back to the rape she survived at 17 and the subsequent depression that Motown never offered her any support for. In July 1967, on her 24th birthday, she was removed from the group she had founded. She sued Motown, lost her house, lost her savings, and died on welfare at 32 years old. The woman who named the Supremes, whose voice is in those harmonies on Baby Love, spent her last years being told by the industry that none of what she built had really been hers. Number 11, Boyz II Men.
You'll be mine forever, baby. You just wait.
For most of the 1990s, Boyz II Men were the best-selling R&B group in the world. End of the Road held the number 1 spot on the Billboard Hot 100 for 13 consecutive weeks in 1992, breaking a record that had stood since Elvis Presley.
We belong together.
I'll Make Love to You did 14 weeks at number 1 in 1994, breaking the group's own record. One Sweet Day with Mariah Carey did 16 weeks. No group in the history of American popular music had ever spent that much time simultaneously at the top of the chart. And underneath all of it, a crack was forming that the records couldn't paper over forever. Michael McCary, bass, the group's towering bass vocalist, whose low notes anchored the bottom of every Boyz II Men arrangement and gave the group's 4-part harmony its full range, was quietly managing a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. The disease was progressive. The touring schedule of the most successful R&B group in the world was, by definition, incompatible with managing a degenerative neurological condition over the long term. By 2003, McCary was gone from the group. The official explanation was health reasons, and that was genuinely true, which makes it both simpler and sadder than the typical lead microphone story. There was no dramatic blow-up, no lawyer's letter, no accusations of ego, just a man whose body could no longer do what the job required. But the transition from 4 voices to 3 permanently altered the sonic architecture of what Boyz II Men was. The full harmonic range that had made End of the Road and I'll Make Love to You what they were simply does not exist without all 4 of those specific voices in combination. The group has performed as a trio ever since. They are still beloved, still touring, still recording. But when you listen to End of the Road and hear all 4 voices stacked against each other in that final section, you are hearing something that can never be reconstructed. The bass note that finishes the chord belongs to a voice that the disease took from the stage. Number 10, SWV. Sisters with Voices. Cheryl Coco Clemens, Tamara Taj Johnson, and Leanne Lely Lyons formed in New York City in 1990, signed to RCA Records, and released their debut album, It's About Time, in 1992. Weak, one of the purest expressions of R&B balladry the decade produced, came from that album, hitting number 1 on the pop chart and the R&B charts simultaneously, and establishing Coco's voice as one of the defining lead instruments in 1990s R&B. It is a vocal performance of extraordinary control and warmth, the kind of voice that makes a simple lyric about losing strength in someone's presence feel like a full-body experience. It is also, almost definitionally, a solo performance with harmonies. Coco sang lead on essentially everything, and that asymmetry, one voice doing the central work while 2 others provided support, was either a structural fact about how the group was best deployed or a slow-building source of resentment, depending on which member's account you find more credible. The group broke up in 1998, reunited in 2005, broke up again, and has cycled through periods of activity and conflict that have kept them from ever rebuilding the sustained commercial momentum of their mid-1990s peak. Coco pursued a gospel solo career that earned her genuine respect in that world. Taj and Lele pursued various projects of their own. The legal battles over the SWV name and touring rights created precisely the kind of public conflict that makes people sympathetic to the idea that someone in the group felt undervalued for a long time. The specific irony is that the problem wasn't that Coco was wrong to be front and center on Weak. She was the right voice for that song. The record is precisely as great as it is because she sang it the way she did. But being right about who should lead a particular record does not make 3 equal partners feel equal, and the gap between what the voice deserved and what the other 2 members received was always going to cost the group something, eventually. If you're locked into this one, most people scrolling past these songs have no idea what it took to make them. Groove Lens digs that history back up, 1 record at a time. The subscribe button costs nothing, and it means you won't miss the next one. Number 9, Toni, Toni, Toni. Brothers Raphael Sadiq and Dwayne Wiggins and their cousin Timothy Christian Riley formed Toni, 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 Toni in Oakland in 1986, and across 4 albums built one of the most consistent and respected catalogs in 1990s R&B. It Never Rains in Southern California, If I Had No Loot, Lay Your Head on My Pillow, and Anniversary, the Grammy-nominated slow jam that became the group's signature. The song still played at weddings and anniversaries 3 decades after its release. But the internal architecture of Toni, Toni, Toné was always uneven, because Raphael Sadiq was, in terms of songwriting ability, production instinct, and broader musical vision, operating at a level that made the group's creative direction increasingly his personal project rather than a shared endeavor.
Anniversary.
His brother and cousin were genuine contributors, but Sadiq was the one drawing the most attention from outside producers, the most interest from other artists, and the most credit from critics who covered the group. When the group dissolved after their fourth album in 1996, the specific reported cause was money disputes and creative differences. Sadiq reportedly felt the financial arrangements no longer reflected his contribution. What followed made the disproportion explicit in a way no interview ever had. Sadiq went on to produce for Beyoncé, Mary J. Blige, D'Angelo, Jill Scott, and Whitney Houston, becoming one of the most acclaimed producers of his generation and winning multiple Grammy Awards. Wiggins and Riley, meanwhile, continued touring as Toni, Toné, without Sadiq for the next 2 decades. Think about that for a moment. The group's name, the group's catalog, the group's touring revenue, being used for 20 years without the man whose creative force had largely built what those things were worth. When Sadiq finally rejoined them for a reunion tour in 2023, it was the first time all three had performed together since 1996. Rolling Stone reported afterward that a new album was planned. It fell apart within months, Sadiq saying the others weren't as committed to recording. The gap that had been there in 1996 was still there in 2024. Number 8. Jodeci. 4 men from the Carolinas who came to New York in 1990 and auditioned for Uptown Records by essentially refusing to leave Andre Harrell's lobby until he agreed to see them. K-Si and JoJo Haley were brothers from Charlotte. Devontae Swing and Mr. Dalvin DeGrate were brothers from Greensboro. 4 men, 2 sets of brothers, one idea about what R&B should sound like in the 1990s. Raw, sexual, gospel-soaked, produced for people who wanted to feel something physical. Forever My Lady launched them. K-Si Haley's lead vocal, ragged at the edges, trembling with what felt like genuine unresolved longing, was the defining instrument of the record and immediately established him as one of the most distinctive lead voices in contemporary R&B. But the creative engine of the group was Devontae Swing, who wrote and produced the music, controlled the group's sound, and had a vision for where the group should go that didn't always align with what K-Si and JoJo wanted for themselves. The tension between a lead singer who was the emotional face of the group and a producer-songwriter who was its creative architect is one of the most reliable sources of destruction in music history. In Jodeci's case, it was compounded by substance abuse that affected multiple members, erratic behavior that made the group increasingly unreliable as a touring and recording unit, and the growing realization by K-Si and JoJo that their voices were commercially viable entirely on their own. They left in the mid-1990s, had an immediate massive hit with All My Life in 1998, and became more commercially successful as a duo than Jodeci had been in its final years. Devontae largely retreated from the public. The group's reunion attempts have been sporadic and mostly inconclusive. 4 men who arrived in a lobby in 1990 with nothing but ambition and 2 sets of brothers' voices ended up going in 2 completely different directions for reasons that sound simple but never really are. Number 7. TLC. T-Boz, Left Eye, Chili. Tiana Watkins, Lisa Lopes, Rosanda Thomas. 3 women who became the best-selling female group of all time, over 70 million records sold, and who operated throughout their entire peak run under a specific internal understanding that was productive and sometimes explosive in equal measure. Left Eye Lisa Lopes was the group's rapper, its visual provocateur, its most uncontainable personality, and arguably its most publicly recognizable individual member. T-Boz was the cool, slightly raspy primary vocalist. Chili was the harmonist. Waterfalls, produced by Organized Noise, featuring one of the decade's most distinctive bass grooves and an anti-violence lyric that felt specific and urgent in 1995, became the group's signature record, spending 7 weeks at #1 on the pop chart and selling over 4 million copies as a single. But in January 1994, Lisa Lopes set fire to her boyfriend, Andre Rison's athletic shoe collection in a bathtub at his Atlanta mansion, and the fire spread and burned the entire house down. Rison, a professional NFL receiver, declined to press charges and later said the couple had reconciled. But Lopes pleaded no contest to arson and served a period in a substance abuse treatment facility. Meanwhile, the 3 members of TLC had collectively filed for bankruptcy in July 1995, the same year Waterfalls was sitting at #1, because the original Pebetone Records contract they had signed gave them less than 2% of the record's wholesale price. Lisa Lopes died in a car accident in Honduras in April 2002, at 30 years old, while the group was attempting to reconcile for a new album. T-Boz and Chili completed the project as a tribute. They have continued touring as TLC, with T-Boz and Chili performing alongside a touring vocalist who represents Lopes' parts, a compromise that honors the legacy while acknowledging the irreplaceable specificity of what the original 3 were together. Number 6. Destiny's Child. The way LeToya, Luckett, and LaTavia Roberson found out they had been removed from Destiny's Child was by watching the music video for Say My Name on television and seeing 2 women they had never met standing in their places. The firing, executed through a lawyer's letter while the group was on tour, replaced with Kelly Rowland's childhood friend Michelle Williams without prior notice to the departing members, was so abrupt that it became the subject of a lawsuit that was eventually settled confidentially. Say My Name hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and the R&B chart in 2000, becoming the group's biggest crossover hit to that point and winning 2 Grammy Awards, Best R&B Song and Best R&B Performance by a Duo or Group with Vocal. It was the record that established Destiny's Child as the dominant female R&B act of the era. And it was made without 2 of the group's 4 founding members, who were removed precisely as the group's commercial momentum was accelerating to its highest point. Matthew Knowles, Beyoncé's father and the group's manager, maintained creative control that the founding members and their own parents, who had formed a separate management entity on their behalf, found increasingly untenable. LeToya and LaTavia later said in interviews that they had attempted to address their concerns about Matthew Knowles' management through a letter to their label, and that the response had been their removal from the group. Beyoncé, in her accounts of this period, has described the transition as painful and complicated. LeToya Luckett released a #1 R&B album under her own name in 2006, proving the commercial value of the voice that Destiny's Child had sidelined. LaTavia has worked in various music and entertainment projects. Beyoncé went on to become the most decorated recording artist in Grammy history. The firing that looked ruthless in 1999 looks, in retrospect, like a preview of exactly how focused the ambition at the center of Destiny's Child really was. Number 5. En Vogue. Don't Let Go, Love was the biggest single En Vogue ever had. Written for the Set It Off soundtrack and produced by Organized Noise, the same team that had just worked with TLC. The song hit number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 in early 1997, held back from number 1 only by Toni Braxton's Unbreak My Heart, and became the group's highest charting pop single ever, their most successful UK record, and the commercial peak of a career that had already produced massive hits with Hold On, My Lovin', You're Never Gonna Get It, and Free Your Mind. The lead vocal on Don't Let Go, Love, belongs entirely to Dawn Robinson. The distinctive, slightly smoky, sultry timbre of her voice is what makes the record sound the way it does, and the label initially attempted to have that lead removed. According to Robinson, and confirmed by the song's producers, Elektra executive Sylvia Rohn called the writers and asked them to replace Dawn's vocal. They refused. The song was a guaranteed hit, the way it was recorded, with Robinson on lead, and they would not change it. The label backed down. What happened next was the group's complete fracture. Dawn Robinson left En Vogue in April 1997, citing a failed solo recording contract negotiation with Aftermath Records. The remaining 3 members had to re-record her lead parts on several tracks of the album they were midway through making. Years of legal battles over the name En Vogue followed, with a judge ultimately ruling that only Cindy Herron and Terry Ellis could tour under the name. Robinson went on to join Lucy Pearl, which also fractured quickly. She launched a solo career that never achieved the commercial traction her talent warranted. As recently as 2025, she revealed she had been living in her car for nearly 3 years. The woman whose voice made En Vogue's biggest record is the member who most clearly never recovered from what the group's internal dynamics cost her. Number 4. New Edition. The short version of the New Edition story is that Bobby Brown was voted out of the group he co-founded and went on to have a more commercially successful solo career than the group he left. The long version is considerably messier. Brown was voted out in early 1986, at 16 years old, by the other 4 members who had collectively decided they could no longer manage his behavior on and off the stage. Ralph Tresvant was the group's natural lead voice, soft, melodic, the heir to a classic R&B falsetto tradition, and had always been the member most visibly groomed for frontman status. MCA Records, recognizing that Brown's removal left a star-shaped hole in the lineup, immediately signed him as a solo artist, which suggests they knew exactly what they were getting rid of. To fill the gap and hedge against Ralph pursuing solo ambitions, Michael Bivins recruited Johnny Gill, a Washington, D.C. vocalist whose powerful, Teddy Pendergrass-influenced baritone was almost diametrically opposed to Tresvant's tone. Nobody told Ralph that Gill was joining. He found out after the fact and was furious. The resulting Heartbreak album, produced by Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, required Tresvant and Gill to coexist as co-lead singers, which they eventually managed. Can You Stand the Rain features both of them alongside Ricky Bell, but the internal tension was real and documented. The group's final reunion tour in 1996 reportedly ended with an actual fight on stage, with gunshots fired during a performance. Bobby Brown later admitted that by the end, their collective egos had grown to a point where individual members were taking separate tour buses to their own shows. When you are too proud to share a bus with the people you make music with, You are not a group anymore. You are 5 solo artists who occasionally perform together out of contractual obligation. Number 3. The Temptations. On June 22, 1968, David Ruffin skipped a Temptations concert date in Cleveland, Ohio, to attend a performance by his new girlfriend, Barbara Gail Martin, who happened to be Dean Martin's daughter. 5 days later, on June 27th, Otis Williams and the other Temptations fired him. It was a clean break in theory, and a catastrophic mess in practice. Ruffin had been the lead voice of the Temptations' greatest commercial run, My Girl, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, Beauty is Only Skin Deep, I Wish It Would Rain, and his departure coincided almost exactly with the group's transition to Norman Whitfield's psychedelic soul era. He was replaced by Dennis Edwards, who was genuinely excellent and who drove the group through a different, equally significant creative period. In a rational world, the story ends there. But David Ruffin believed he was bigger than the Temptations, and for several months in 1968, he demonstrated that belief by showing up uninvited to Temptations performances during Edwards's early dates with the group. He would stand in the wings, wait until a song he had recorded, My Girl, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, began, and then walk on stage and physically take the microphone out of Dennis Edwards's hands in front of the audience, mid-song. He had been demanding for 2 years that the group rename itself David Ruffin and the Temptations, the same way Berry Gordy had repositioned Diana Ross at the front of the Supremes. His cocaine use had inflated the ego without proportionally inflating the judgment required to manage it. He also began asking Motown's accounting department for a full financial audit of the group's earnings, which brought him into direct conflict with Gordy's business operation. He died in 1991, a John Doe, in a crack house with $53 in his pocket, never having made another record that matched what the Temptations had done together. Dennis Edwards stayed with the group long enough to record Papa Was a Rollin' Stone. The group survived the ego. The man behind the ego did not. Number 2. KCI and JoJo. KCI and JoJo Haley did not leave Jodeci on good terms, and they made one of the greatest records in R&B history immediately after. All My Life spent 15 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1998, making it the longest-running number 1 single in the chart's history at that point, tying the record that Boyz II Men had set with I'll Make Love to You, and then briefly surpassed with One Sweet Day. The song is a gospel-inflected ballad of absolute devotional love, built almost entirely on KCI's voice and its raw, deeply churchy emotional urgency.
Sweeter than you, sweeter than you.
The distance from Jodeci to All My Life was not simply artistic, it was personal. The relationship between the Haley brothers and Devontae Swing had deteriorated through the mid-1990s as Jodeci's behavior became increasingly erratic. Their touring reliability collapsed, and Devontae's control over the group's creative output and its finances generated accusations that never fully resolved into confirmed facts, but clearly generated enough bitterness to make reconciliation difficult. What is verifiable is this: KCI and JoJo left, made All My Life, and the record sold over 4 million copies and gave them commercial success that Jodeci, in its final functional years, had not approached. The voice that had been the face of Jodeci turned out to be more than sufficient to carry an entirely different career trajectory, on its own terms, without the group that had initially contained it. KCI Haley has spoken in public about his struggles with substance abuse throughout this period, struggles that also affected Jodeci's final years and his own subsequent career. And his brother JoJo has been credited repeatedly with keeping the duo functional during periods when Casey's personal life was in serious disarray. The specific mechanics of what destroyed Jodeci remain somewhat opaque in official accounts. What is clear is that the aftermath, for Casey and JoJo, included one of the greatest R&B singles of the decade. Sometimes leaving is the right call. Number 1. The Four Tops. The Four Tops never broke up. Not once. Not ever. Levi Stubbs, Abdul Duke Fakir, Ronaldo Obi Benson, and Lawrence Payton sang together for over 4 decades without a single member being fired, leaving in anger, suing another member, or going solo. In a genre whose entire history is littered with groups that fell apart over exactly those things, the Four Tops are the specific exception that makes the rule feel even more absolute. What makes them remarkable as the number 1 entry on this list is not that they destroyed themselves. They didn't. It's what their story reveals, by contrast, about every other group that did. Levi Stubbs had one of the most distinctive, powerful, emotionally overwhelming lead voices in the history of soul music. His performances on Reach Out, I'll Be There, Bernadette, I Can't Help Myself, and Standing in the Shadows of Love are raw, physically urgent, barely contained, the sound of a man singing right at the edge of his own capacity. If Levi Stubbs had had a David Ruffin's ego, the Four Tops would have been a 30-year soap opera. He didn't. Duke Fakir has given dozens of interviews over the decades explaining how the group managed it, and the answer is always essentially the same. They were friends before they were famous. They decided early that no single person's ambition would override the group's collective purpose, and they held to that even when the commercial pressure and the industry's logic both pushed towards solo stardom. Lawrence Payton died of liver cancer in June 1997. Levi Stubbs suffered a stroke in 1998 that gradually limited his ability to perform. Ronaldo Benson died in 2005. Duke Fakir has kept the group going with new members, honoring the legacy. The point is that the original Four Tops lasted together through everything the music industry threw at them, and the thing that eventually ended the original lineup was not ego or money or creative control. It was simply mortality. In soul music, that is almost miraculous. There is nothing in the music industry quite like a vocal group that cannot agree on who gets to be the star. Not managers, not label executives, not bad contracts. Just 5 people who all believe, with complete sincerity, that the group would be fine if it were just them on the stage alone. Tonight, 12 soul and R&B groups that prove that theory wrong, spectacularly, in front of the entire world. Every story is verified. Every song is one you already know.